request the following procedures be followed. As in all meetings, there should be no side conversations between participants. Therefore, online chat should not be used except to communicate with the meeting moderator, not between each other. Please keep your microphone muted unless called upon to speak. There's not going to be any public comment tonight taken during tonight's session. Public comments may be emailed after tonight's meeting to the flood board office, and we'll take them there. Flood Service Area Program Lead Stephanie Presley will be making a presentation to us. There will be several points during the presentation where she'll break for questions and comments. At these points, Mayor Terry or myself will call upon each participant in round robin fashion, just to provide everyone an opportunity to speak. If you don't have anything to say, just say so. So at this time, I would like the Flood Service Area Board members to introduce themselves, and at this time also let the new board members if you have any questions about the meeting procedures for this evening. Randy, we'll start with you.
Okay, I think I'm on mute now. I think you're able to hear me. This is Randy.
Randy, go.
Stop, everybody froze.
It just froze. We love Zoom.
Sister there, I think everyone is frozen right now. I apologize.
Yeah, we're all frozen.
Heather's.
It's like one of those games.
So we didn't hear anything after Randy said, "This is Randy."
My Zoom locked up. I don't know how to do for everybody else, but I can see that online.
Randy, I got the sense the entire Zoom session went down. You're back live now.
Okay. Don't know what went through before. This is Randy Shaw for board member. What board? You're muted, Mark.
Yep, Bob, introduce yourself, please. Bob with us and unmuted.
Heather, you could unmute everybody for this introduction.
Bob, can you introduce yourself?
This is Bob Reisner, CP, Seward, Bear Creek, Flood Service Area.
Thanks, Bob. Ed?
This is Ed DeCastro, Seward, Bear Creek, Flood Board member.
Dwayne?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Dancer. This is Dwayne Acklin with the Flood Board representing CP. And Stephen, with us this evening.
I'm with you. I'm Stephen Taylor, Flood Board.
And Orson.
Good evening. I'm Orson Smith with the Flood Board.
That's our Flood Board, myself, as Chair Mark Dancer. Mayor Terry, would you introduce the members from the City Council participating this evening?
Yeah, let me start off by saying thank you to the Flood Board. We're really looking for your expertise tonight, and we're thankful that you guys took time in the evening to help educate us on this topic. I am Mayor Christy Terry, and then we'll just go counterclockwise and have everyone introduce themselves.
Excuse me, I'm Cheryl Cease, Council.
Hi, Scott Mazzaros, City Manager.
John Arsenga, City Council.
We have City Clerk Brenda Ballou with us also.
And Sue McClure, Vice Mayor.
Okay.
Is Dale?
Dale hasn't called in though.
Is Is there anyone participating online from the council right here?
Not at this time.
All right, then I'd like to introduce Stephanie Presley will be giving our presentation this evening. Stephanie is the flood board program lead, and will give you an overview of the work that the flood board has done in the past briefly, and then discuss options that the board feels may be the best route forward for mitigating flood damage from Resurrection River. Stephanie, please.
Good evening, everyone. Please let me know if you can't hear me, and hopefully we won't have another freeze up like we did. I've been with the flood service area since 2011, and I was asked tonight to discuss mitigation measures for Resurrection River. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone had the opportunity to take a look at the packet tonight. I'm not going to go through page by page. Basically, there are many different types of hazard mitigation, starting with studies, understanding what's happening within the floodplain, moving on to hazard or risk hazard mapping. Currently, the city and the borough are both participants in the National Flood Insurance Program. Both administer their own floodplain regulations that's based off of the federal regulations. There are some changes to both the city and the borough code, so we don't have minimum regulations right now, but it's pretty close as far as our flood hazard mapping goes. We use the flood insurance rate map, which is what is considered the 100-year flood event, or the 1% annual chance of flooding. Other types of mitigation measures are structural, for example, armoring infrastructure, such as a bridge, building feeder dikes, bio-revetments using ripwads. Other mitigation measures will include non-structural measures, such as acquisition of parcels to remove them from development potential, or conservation easements are another mechanism that can keep floodplain properties from being developed to begin with. In our area, somewhat unique to the Pacific Northwest, we deal with sedimentation loads, and so we have sediment management plans or debris maintenance plans, and full comprehensive mitigation plans. So tonight, like I said, I provided you with a full packet of information. I'm not going to go through all of this. I was thinking that we talk a little bit in brief about the Resurrection River Maintenance Plan that was drafted in 2006. Take a break for discussion and comments, and then we can move on talking about engineered studies and design plans for the Army Corps of Engineers Continuing Authorities programs. And then we can take a break there for discussion. I can briefly talk to you about permitting requirements for any development within the floodplain. And if necessary, I can answer questions then. And then we'll talk a little bit about different project costs or funding mechanisms that might be available. And then the last topic I'd like to discuss is something that we could possibly move forward with fairly quickly, and that is floodplain parcel acquisitions. So the Resurrection River Debris Maintenance Plan was drafted in 2006 following the flood event at that time. It's a really good example, I think, of how important it is for flood mitigation to be successful, that you may need multiple components and many agencies involved with flood mitigation. And like I said, I'm not going to go through this step by step, but the 2006 plan was an update of the multi-agency task force that was formed following the 1995 flood event. For those of you following through on your packet, page 3 begins the list of agencies that were part of that 1997 task force and their general responsibilities. Page 4 continues the list, and I would like to point out that everybody agreed the importance of working together for the benefit of coordinating mitigation projects. The 97 task force did a lot of work and came up with a lot of good plans for us, for our community. On page 5 of the packet, some of those projects included at the bottom here, you can see there's 5 different projects, including construction of 2 different sections of the Japanese Creek levee. The Natural Resources Conservation Service constructed the second half of the levee, and the city completed the paved section of Dick Graff Road. Alaska Railroad expanded the railroad trestles, and the Department of Transportation increased the height of the Seward Highway bridges across Resurrection River. The borough was responsible for the debris and sediment removal project, and then there was a full flood mitigation plan developed. And that last sentence there on page 5, it's important to note that all 5 projects identified were required for the plan to be effective, and without each component, flood risk would remain high. So this maintenance plan is a good example of the multiple components needed for flood mitigation. I'm jumping ahead to page 11 for those of you following along in the packet. Hopefully you guys did your reading. This is actually a map showing the debris extraction or sediment management project in the northeastern channel of Resurrection River. That was one component of the plan for both the 1998 plan and for the 2006 update of this plan. There were lots of things that went into this update of the plan, including new floodplain mapping, dealing with some challenges around sediment management that we'll talk about in brief later, public outreach, land use management. So this plan ended up with 10 different action items, and at this point in time, the majority of these action items have been completed or are ongoing. So you can see developing inventories of problem areas or potential retrofit for flood-proofing structures, for example. Seeking grants or technical partnerships to complete mapping and hydrological studies, compiling that information and data that's so key to understanding what our actual hazards are and what structures are at hazard of flooding or erosion. Using the information that you gathered in those studies to enhance mitigation strategies. I know that the city and the borough and the flood service area, all 3 went through our hazard mitigation plans last year to update those. And we took a look at several of the studies that have been compiled the 5 years previous to add to the work that we do. Objective number 5 on page 15. This is one that probably could use more action, and that's an annual review of this plan. So I might recommend during the next year's annual review to actually review the Resurrection River Maintenance Plan in addition to hazard mitigation plans. Moving on to page 16, we've got the update of our hazard mapping, digital elevation mapping. We did get FEMA contractor, they came in 2009, and they did the survey data necessary to update our flood hazard mitigation maps. Those were adopted eventually. There was some delays, but those were adopted in October 2013 by both the borough and the city. And just recently, the GIS team at the borough has uploaded digital elevation models to our parcel viewer, which are very interesting to take a look at if you get a chance to visit the flood service area parcel viewer. So looking at that digital elevation mapping. Mapping is something in our community that we will continue to work on. Objective 7, prioritizing and implementing cost-effective strategies for controlling flood damage. This is something that the flood board looks at every year as we prioritize what projects we need to spend our resources on. And this is something that we look at anytime we update our hazard mitigation plans. So keeping in mind, cost-effective strategies or feasibility strategies And then moving on to 17 of the packet, objective number 8 is one item that needs more action. Recommending that the Borough Administration institute a revolving flood maintenance fund. Over the years, this recommendation has been made to all of our borough administrators. It has been made to all of the governors that we've had in the last decade. It has been made to our state hazard mitigation officer at the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. At one point in time, we were gaining some traction with the state. They were looking at a Washington state example for flood mitigation fund that would allow mitigation outside of the traditional types of programs that we'll talk a little bit more about. As everybody knows, recent years the state's been going through a financial crisis, and that funding mechanism for flood mitigation didn't get very far with the state. Objective number 9 is very important for the habitat in which we work, fish and wildlife. So scheduling projects to occur during low water, oftentimes for fish and game permitting. This is very early in the spring after juveniles have dropped out and before the adults run. And objective number 10 is an item that could use action, and this was maintaining water levels at or below the original project level. So this was maintenance of the debris catch basin that was excavated in 1998. So Chair, I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions about the Resurrection River maintenance plan.
I'll just round robin everyone here. Bob, any questions or comments on the maintenance plan? Hearing none. Ed?
Do not have anything.
Dwayne, comments or questions?
No, I don't have anything at this time, thanks.
Okay, Stephen?
Were there any examples or plans to, as to how we were going to maintain the water level at or below that point at the time that this was done? In
That's
item 10?
a question. So the next page that I have up on screen is page 20 of your packet. And that was $20,000 from the borough to supplement or match funds that were appropriated from FEMA and the state Homeland Security and Emergency Management. For that initial extraction project, there was $732,000. I don't know how much of that went specifically to the extraction project, but the borough at the time did appropriate $20,000. And then on page 22 of your packet, the city appropriated $10,000. And I believe back in 98, the intent was to set up some type of maintenance fund in order to keep the channel extracted. Did I answer your question, Stephen?
Yes, thank you.
Morrison, questions or comments at this time?
Nothing to add, Mark.
Thank you. Mayor Terry, council members, please.
Thanks. What I'll do is I'll look around the room, see if there's any comments.
Oh, where are you, Randy? I'm sorry, Randy.
Oh.
I was just gonna ask, has there been any, or when was the last time work was done in that catchment area? Was that back in '98? Was that the last time anything was done in that area?
It's actually one of the questions I had for any city staff that might be familiar. I've been told that following the 2006 event, there was an excavation in the same area, but I haven't found any plans or funding mechanisms or any other information about that. So that might be a question for people within the city if they were here and could answer that.
So I guess we need to know the answer to that question, but then the next question is, if nothing has been done for, 20 some years, and even if it was done 2006. That area is probably totally filled up at this point. And so at this point, it's not doing any good if it's been even a few years since any of that material was extracted from that catchment area. That's my comment.
Okay, thank you, Randy, and I won't miss you next time. Mayor Terry, the council members, please.
We looked around the room and there's no comments at this time.
And the clerks are on mute.
Sorry, we looked around the room and we have no comments at this time.
Oh, this cannot, okay. Any other, background, is any comments from the flood board? Hearing none, thank you, Stephanie. Continue.
So there's a couple of options moving forward. We actually wanted to look at different mitigation measures within Resurrection River, keeping in mind that that might end up being several different mitigation measures. So one option would be to move forward and rechannelize and excavate the original project site from that 1998 northeastern channel of Resurrection River. My research found that there was about 350,000 cubic yards of material removed following the 95 flood event. And like we just looked at, there was about 360, give or take, $1,000 put towards that project. So looking at the possibility of redoing that project, we would want to weigh some different information. So a benefit cost analysis. Anytime you do mitigation work, you want to look at, what are the benefits we're getting and how much is this costing taxpayers. So in recent years, the least expensive rate we've gotten per cubic yard for the extraction and the removal of material from the floodplain has been about $5 a cubic yard. And that's for much smaller quantities, so with such a huge amount of material to be removed, it's possible we get a much better rate. But 350,000 cubic yards at $5 a cubic yard to remove it from the floodplain is a $1.75 million project. So we have to look at, is that the best use of taxpayer dollars? We tend to look at mitigation in terms of length of time. So we have short-term mitigation projects that have to occur to keep a culvert open so floodwaters don't ruin a road. And that may be a 2-week or a 2-month short-term mitigation project. We have those mid-term mitigation projects that may last a bit longer, that give us a couple years to work on elevating the road and putting in bridges. And then we have the long-term mitigation that oftentimes we will look at 30, 50 years out. Is the structure going to keep floodwaters from overtopping and entering the neighborhood? And so really when we look at realignment or rechannelizing or repeating the sediment extraction from that northeastern channel, we have to look at what is the benefit cost analysis and how long will this get us. So I did reach out back in March when we were planning our original work session to R&M consultants and ask some questions of their water resource engineer. And I've had the opportunity to talk to several different hydrologists, including the State Department of Transportation hydrologist, the consultant that worked on the DOT hydraulic and hydrologic study, and that's the memo from that consultant is on page 39 of your packet if you're interested. But basically everybody agreed that Resurrection River has high sediment loads. It's a braided stream, meaning the channels are going to change from event to event. It takes one log in the river to change the direction of flows. It's a river delta, so the slope there of the floodplain is very gradual. It's going to constantly deposit that material. And basically that any excavated channel could be filled within a couple of days. And we see this quite often on projects that we call short-term mitigation projects for a reason, where we clean out the channel, we have, a good storm event come through the next week, and the following week you barely know that we've done any work there. So looking at a study in order to rechannelize Resurrection River from R&M Consultants, it would take, new LiDAR data, new bathymetry surveys, so we knew what the channel was doing underneath the water, running through different flood hazard modeling, looking at different excavation configurations, and developing a preferred alternative for what that channel should look like. Floodplain permitting and the CLOMAR process we can talk a little bit about later on. But basically his take on things and what I've heard from other hydrologists is that, this would probably take a couple of years and several $100,000 just to come up with design plans for the best options. So we weren't causing adverse impacts to adjacent properties. And, really most hydrologists or floodplain managers would recommend spending those funds on a better long-term mitigation option. So that leads us to page 27 of the packet, which is partnering with the Army Corps of Engineers looking at their continuing authorities programs. So there's two in particular that I'll point out that the Resurrection River area may be an option for. Section 14 of the Clean Water Act provides the Army Corps of Engineers the authority to do stream bank stabilization, shoreline protection, work on existing infrastructure. The challenge with a Section 14 project is that in order for the Army Corps to expend construction funds on infrastructure, the local sponsor, which is the community, would need to have site control or ownership of the structure itself. Feasibility studies are, for the most part, the same throughout the continuing authorities programs. The first $100,000, the feds do an initial study to determine whether or not there's federal interest in continuing. And then after that, the remainder of the feasibility study is a 50-50 cost share. And once you move to a preferred alternative, then that's a 65-35 with a 35% local match. Local matches can include the land, the value of the land that the infrastructure is on. It can include in-kind services from the staff that work on the project. There's a couple of contributions that can be made towards that 35%, so it doesn't all have to be cash. But the second continuing authorities program is the Section 205 flood risk management, and this is what we're working on with the Corps for the Japanese Creek study right now. So the flood risk management program allows the Army Corps to look at all the different alternatives, whether it be structural, non-structural, acquisition, sediment management. They take everything under consideration. Can we move the airport? Can we rechannelize the river? And so that is a much more in-depth feasibility study where they literally take every alternative and they start to eliminate some of those for, maybe they're too expensive or there's not practical place to put an airport or whatever the reasoning behind eliminating that initial alternatives, until they pare it down to a few where they do a full analysis. And they come up with a preferred alternative. Sometimes it's maybe a range of 4 different alternatives, like an early warning system and retrofitting the infrastructure and buying out some properties and flood-proofing the critical structures on the alluvial fan. So they might come up with a full range of alternatives for the construction phase of a Section 205. And so again, the 205 is a 35% local match once you move to the construction phase. with a section 205, site control is not required for the feasibility study, is my understanding. But during the course of the feasibility study, you would want to work towards some sort of site control of any infrastructure that was undergo construction. So those are some options as far as engineered study and design to figure out what our best mitigation measures would be for Resurrection River. And Chair, I'm going to pause there for any questions or comments.
All right, I'll call on board members again. Ed, questions or comments?
I do not have any, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Dwayne?
No, I don't have anything to add, thank you.
Stephen?
None at this time.
Orson?
I will just say, Mark, that these continuing authorities have been used a lot in Alaska with the Corps of Engineers and Alaska District. For example, at Boat Harbor, Section 107, it's a speedier process than their alternative at the Corps to get congressional approval for a project. And then a general comment on the Corps' way of doing things, because I worked for them for over 20 years. I would say that their cost-benefit analysis involves a very constrained analysis of benefits that sometimes leave out benefits that are local or even regional in nature. So that their rules are very strict there. But for the most part, the continuing authorities is a really good way to go to get something done in a reasonable amount of time and in a scale of less than 10 years versus decades that the congressional authority approach can take. I hope that helped a little. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you for those comments, Orson. Randy? Questions or comments?
Yeah, I'll make one comment. Stephanie, when you were talking about how the flood board looks at some things we do, and you said we have short-term, mid-term, and long-term projects, just for informational purposes, we also have the emergency situation authority, if you will, that has come out, has been fairly recent, but you might just talk a little bit about what that means and what we do in those emergent situations, and the fact that we have a minuscule budget for that. But just make sure that the council members are aware that we do that, those types of budgets.
Did you want to address, describe that, Stephanie, or Randy in the council?
Sure. So the flood service area mission is planning, protection, and mitigation. We do not do emergency response, and so there was kind of a gray area several years ago as to, we know we have a situation that's emerging that could devolve into an emergency. And what is the best funding mechanism? What's the best chain of command? How can we leverage flood board funding and get in there quickly without having to have a full flood board meeting to appropriate funding? And so we worked together with the borough, different departments to establish an emerging situation policy. And we have a $10,000 annual budget, unless the board adds to that, to myself, the chair, and the emergency manager at the borough to get together and come to a consensus on the best course of action so we can move rapidly and respond to a situation so it does not become an emergency. And our standard procedure afterwards is to provide an after-action report to the board that says, we did this work on this day because of this situation, and we spent this much money. So that keeps the board informed as to any work that basically has been done, so we don't have a bigger incident. Back to you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Bob, do you have any questions or comments at this time?
Not at this time, but I have an idea for future planning, but it goes beyond the scope of what we're discussing tonight.
Okay, we'll look forward to that, Bob. I had one comment, and that is, I just think it's really important that second to last paragraph in the R&M Consulting letters basically states that maintenance isn't a solution here. There has to be something more than that if we really want to protect the airport.
That is correct, and we will have to hard bank the western shores the eastern shore, so it cannot go back over towards the airport. Riprap has been known to fly out of there during flood events. We could not get equipment over roof wads, and I don't think those would work. Board reinforced concrete is too expensive, and riprap, sheet piling might be our only viable option. It's local.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Mayor Terry, questions or comments from the council?
I'll start off with mine and then I'll look around the room. So, board member Orson Smith mentioned a timeline, and he alluded to potentially less than 10 years. So I was wondering if Stephanie if we're looking at a 205, what that timeline might be. And then my second question is, since what we're looking at is really protecting state infrastructure in the airport, it is important to the borough and the city, but since it's state infrastructure, if they provided funds, would those be considered, could those be counted as matching funds against the federal match? So those are two questions I have.
Sure. So the section 205 that we started on Salmon Creek and Japanese Creek, from the time we started the initial study, which is basically the reconnaissance study the Corps completes to see if there's federal interest, until the time that we completed construction of the Salmon Creek revetment at the top of the canyon at the base of Tiger Mountain, that was about 8 years. And I would add to that part of that was finding the funding in order to move forward with construction. We ended up having a flood event and got state grant funding. So the expectation with the Japanese Creek Section 205, the feasibility study, the initial study, that reconnaissance study, was completed in 2013 at the same time as the Salmon Creek study. And so that initial piece has been done. And the feasibility study is expected to be completed before the end of next calendar year. So it is expected to be less than 2 years to come up with the Army Corps' preferred alternative, run it through the federal finding of no significant impact, and have a report ready to go for the community. The intent would be for everybody to start looking for funding now. It's hard to say in the world of pandemic, but if we're ready to go with our funding and we have a good estimate that we need to come up with $2.5 million and in-kind services from staff and ownership of the Japanese Creek levee during that time period, then construction could begin in a matter of the next construction season. And that could be done pretty quickly. So yes, I would say that a Section 205 could take 8 to 10 years, but my expectation with a Section 205 with the Resurrection River, knowing what critical infrastructure is being protected, and if there's interest from the Army Corps, which at one point in time they had expressed, I don't think that timeline would be so long. I think it would be a matter of 3 to 5 years to complete construction. And then your second question was if the state provided matching funds. So the local sponsorship can actually be multiple entities. And the way that we have created a local sponsor team here on the Japanese Creek 205 is that all of the borough, the flood board, and the city have contributed matching funds. And between the borough flood service area and the city, we have a memorandum of understanding that details out between the two municipalities and the borough what needs to be accomplished by each group during the course of the feasibility study. So I think that if the state Department of Transportation was willing to be one of the local sponsors, there could be some sort of agreements, that were put in place for there to be multiple local sponsors to work on this one Section 205 with the Army Corps. And then at that point in time, and you're leveraging 50% of the study funds, have the expertise of not only the Alaska District engineers and their team, their planners, but you have the resources from nationwide. That throughout the feasibility study, that expertise is brought in to review what work has been done by the Alaska District. So hopefully that answered your two questions, Mayor.
Yeah, thank you very much. So then I'll go around the room. Councilmember Cease, did you have any questions?
No, but could I have Randy speak louder when he's talking?
Okay, Did you hear that, Chair Ganser and Board Member Stauffer? Just when Randy's speaking, if he could speak louder. John, did you have any comments or questions? City Manager, did you have any?
No.
Okay, looks like we're good here to continue. Thank you.
Okay, Stephanie, if you can continue, please.
So I'll talk briefly about permitting for any type of development that occurs within the floodplain. So both the city and the borough are National Flood Insurance Program participants, and they administer their own floodplain development ordinance. Within the floodplain, you have the floodway, which is what's considered the 100-year or the 1% annual chance of flooding main channel, and then you have the floodplain where floodwaters will spread out, and that is also considered a regulatory area. Within a floodway, any development between the borough and the city code both have a no-rise requirement, which means that any development that occurs cannot elevate the base flood elevations that have been determined through the flood insurance rate maps. So that 100-year flood event has provided us with elevations of floodwaters called the base flood elevation. And a proposed development has to prove through an engineer stamp or a conveyance calculation that there will be no rise to adjacent properties and no rise to that base flood elevation. The way that our floodplain administrators between the borough and the city can receive assistance to look at a proposed project is to submit a CLOMAR, which is a conditional letter of map revision. And all of the flood hazard modeling that goes into developing a project by an engineer gets run through some type of software system, whether it's HAZUS or HECRAS, and they send the applicant, the person that's proposing to do the development, sends all of that information to FEMA for FEMA's comment. So the R&M consultant said that this could take a number of years. We did recently have a conditional letter of map revision for the Preacher's Pond development that was sent to FEMA, and it was actually a very quick turnaround. It took, I think, maybe 60 days for FEMA to review it and provide the borough with comments about the development and the increases to the base flood elevation in the Salmon Creek floodway. So that is a floodplain development permit. The state fish and game habitat permit is obviously to protect our wildlife and our salmon runs. And the fish and game permit is usually a pretty easy one to get as long as you comply with the stipulations or conditions. For example, within Seward, They're very aware how detrimental huge quantities of gravel can be flowing down our streams and how damaging that can be to our salmon runs. So strategical removal of sediment is allowed by State Fish and Game as long as we conduct those activities in most streams during the fish window. And that's usually very early spring, allow the juveniles to drop out and before the adult run comes in. I'm going to come back to the State Department of Natural Resources because that takes a little bit more explanation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for any eagle's nest or migratory bird habitat, require a nest take permit is what it's called. The bald eagle's nest, if you work within 600 feet of a nest, which basically anywhere in the Resurrection River Delta, you're going to find an eagle's nest within 600 feet. You're required to get a permit that goes through agency and public review through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The last one that we did was a project on Clear Creek, and that took about 6 months in order to go through the permitting process for the Eagle's Nest permit. The Army Corps of Engineers, they have multiple different types of permits, but basically some permits or some type of work can be covered under a nationwide permit that's, as it says, provided at the nationwide level. And for example, doing bank stabilization or restoration, those can be covered under a nationwide permit, and there is no permit application process if you meet the requirements of those nationwide permits. There's also regional permits. The Army Corps has started to look at whether or not a regional permit for Alaska or sediment management plans that have been approved might be a possibility in the near future. Otherwise, probably a big project in Resurrection River would be required to go through the individual permit. And that process can be lengthy depending on the project. Oftentimes the Army Corps will require mitigation. For example, if you're going to be filling in wetlands, they'll require a set aside of similar functional wetlands in another area that won't be developed. So the Army Corps of Engineers process can take some time depending on the project, and they're really looking to determine what is the least environmentally impactful project that you can do to accomplish the goal. And now going back to the State Department of Natural Resources, this may be more information than you need, but basically the state lands and anywhere that is deemed navigable by the state is required to pay the state a material sales fee for any mineral rights, including removal of gravel from our local streams. Navigable streams within our area are Resurrection River, Salmon Creek up to the confluence of Clear Creek, and there's some tidal areas for Sawmill Creek that are deemed navigable by the state. The Army Corps and the state navigability determinations are different in some instances. With DNR, there was a large group of various people that worked with our state legislatures. The material sales fee used to be about $3.25 a cubic yard, which adds very quickly when you're looking to do a sediment management project. In 2012, different groups worked with legislatures to pass a statute that allows municipalities, for flood control reasons, to remove material from navigable waters or state lands at no charge. So DNR permits, you get usually, if you're on state lands, a land use permit, and then you also get a material sales contract at no charge. That statute was put in place in 2012. 2014, they came out with kind of a draft list of requirements for a site-specific mitigation plan for sediment extraction projects. The Flood Service area submitted the first to DNR in 2018, and we were notified about 10 days ago that final decision has gone through, and we are being provided for Sawmill Creek upstream of the Nash Road Bridge, the first site-specific sediment management, no sales material contract. So DNR, when this 2016 Resurrection River maintenance plan was updated, or 2006, sorry, when this was updated, DNR was one of the big challenges, and that took, what are we at, 14 years? We now have a site-specific mitigation plan for one of our watersheds. Can I answer any questions, or are there any comments about permitting?
Dwayne, any questions, comments for Stephanie?
Well, just a thought. I believe that, there is some amount of aggregate that's being removed from the system now. There are commercial operators that are permitted, and perhaps there is some avenue there that might allow for better maintenance of the problem portions of the channel or channels.
Thank you, Dwayne. Good comment. Stephen?
No, sir.
Okay. Orson? Nothing from Orson. Randy, questions or comments at this time?
I don't have any comments. I'm just curious whether you can hear me now.
That's better.
We'll check when we go around the room there. Bob, questions or comments at this time?
No questions. Just a concern about the Clomar on the no rise certificate, even though Mother Nature dropped us 8.5 feet in '64 during the earthquake, why we couldn't possibly rechannel Resurrection River over to the eastern side of the alluvial fan, separating the outlet from Salmon Creek and hard panning the shoreline along the western shore of Resurrection River after it's rechanneled, dig in catch basin areas and reach in there with an excavator and take it out annually. And then just put the gravel right behind that wall, and then you got a place where you can build an alluvial fan for future development. We're gonna have to have more development in the city for economic platform.
Yeah, Bob, I think that all requires the engineering that we may be looking at.
Yes, surveys, engineers, architects, the whole nine, you betcha.
Ed, questions or comments at this time?
No comment, thank you.
Okay. Mayor Terry, the council?
I'll start off with my question. So Stephanie, are you saying with all that permitting and potential Clomar needs, that would be included in the timeline of the 3 to 5 years with the 205? Or do you see starting some of that permitting ahead of time?
I think it'd be pretty easy if we had a good idea of what the project was going to be to start some of that permitting ahead of time. With the Clomar, that's a pretty specific, project-specific need in order to run that, that configuration of channel design, for example, through the HECRAS or HAZUS modeling to show whether or not they're going to cause a rise. So you might get to the point, pretty far into almost being done with a preferred alternative before you're able to start the Clomar process. As far as, DNR permitting, I think now that we have a sediment management plan that can be used as a template for our different watersheds, that makes that process much shorter. They have their regulations in place. They know what they're looking for now. And then as far as the other permits, the individual permit through the Army Corps would be just a matter of months. And if you're working with the Army Corps themselves, once they've developed their preferred alternative, they will submit applications to the regulatory teams. So part of that section 205 is for them to go and receive the permits required to do the construction.
Okay. And then I guess just another comment on the cost of the gravel. You know, I feel like we have a pretty good case. Sounds like you already have a site-specific setup, but I feel like a pretty good case in this, if we're protecting state infrastructure, an argument for them to not charge us for the gravel being extracted. But I'll just leave that there and check around. Any comments in the... Okay, we'll go ahead then.
I think, Mayor Terry, the question on the resources, there's something to do with this state constitution and getting full market value for our resources.
Yeah.
Stephanie?
Yeah, and I might add that one of the reasons why we started with Sawmill Creek for our site-specific sediment management plan was because it was protecting the state road.
Exactly.
And that road is the only access to the state prison, so we expected it to be a pretty simple process, but I think there's challenges at any time they have a new state or a new statute that they have to go through and develop those regulations and requirements for implementing that statute. So moving on to project costs, there's different options for funding. We've talked a little bit about if we were to recreate the 1998 excavation project, we were to pull 350,000 cubic yards of material from Resurrection River at $5 a yard. That's a $1.75 million project. We've talked about the Army Corps of Engineers Section 205 project. So Japanese Creek is a complex alluvial fan. There's a lot of challenges there. That study cost for the 2-year feasibility study is a $900,000 project, of which local sponsors came up with 50%. So the borough, the flood board, and the city provided a match of $450,000 for that study. There's other mitigation grants and funding sources. Quite often they are very specific as to what type of project they're able to fund. So for example, anytime we have a federal disaster declaration, a percentage of the total recovery cost for that declaration goes into a hazard mitigation grant program. And that's provided by the feds, and we're one of the few states that still provides a match to that program. And so we can get hazard mitigation grants fully funded 100% between the feds and the states. The challenge there is that it's very specific as to the type of projects that they want to fund. The state governor has the discretion of selecting, we're going to prioritize only earthquake retrofit projects with this pot of money. And that has happened, following the 2012 flood event that hit many different communities. But the state governor chose to spend the hazard mitigation grants all up in Galena, and the borough of the city put in hazard mitigation grant applications that weren't funded through that disaster declaration. There's other federal programs like pre-disaster mitigation, and then there's funding that comes available when you have a flood event in your community, like the Emergency Watershed Protection Fund. And again, most of those programs are very specific as to the type of project that they would be willing to fund. Oftentimes that's a shovel-ready, brick and mortar or rip-rap, whatever you want to call it, project, and they're very hesitant to fund anything like sediment management or channel design, extraction, or channel realignment, with the understanding that that's going to be a short-term solution. Other funding mechanisms that have been discussed is that mitigation fund at the state or the borough level that would allow us a flood mitigation fund or hazard mitigation fund that could allow us to do those other types of projects that aren't covered by state and federal grants. And one of the things that was included in the flood service areas FY21 budget was a forecasted increase to the mill rate. The flood board has not discussed this as of yet. That was put in there by Borough Administration to really look at recovering costs from the loss of the pandemic and the tax revenues, which I'm sure the city will be looking at as well. So it's possible if we, were to discuss as a community increasing the mill rate for a, flood mitigation specific to Resurrection River projects, that might be another much smaller funding source. So those are some of the options for funding, and I think we've covered most of the project costs for these types of projects in Resurrection River. So open it up to any questions, Chair.
Yes, Stephen, questions for Stephanie or comments?
No, sir. Not at this time.
Orson, or you have any questions or comments at this time?
Yes, I'd like to comment on the cost estimate. This scale of project is large enough where the cost of engineering and design would be significant. And likewise the contract administration. So if we take the $5 a yard to be the cost of a construction contract, the rule of thumb is that the engineering and design portion would be 10% more, and likewise the contract administration would be 10% more. So that would make it a $2 to $2.1 million project, and that's the price that would be cost shared in the Corps of Engineers process, for example. So we really should round off, so to speak, to allow for engineering and design costs, the cost of hiring an engineer to do the plans, and the cost of administering the contract, all quality assurance and so forth. That's agency costs that would be charged to the cost sharing agreement. So I would say that we are talking around $2 million project here. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Orson. Randy, do you have any questions or comments at this time?
Yeah, I guess I'll, hopefully everybody can hear me. I will comment maybe a little bit on, in addition to what Orson was saying, I think that $2 million that we're talking about is basically to duplicate what was done back in '98. Is that correct? That's to dig out a catch basin, for a certain area, and we know that that solution will not last very long at all. And so I think that Board Member Reisner has put forward a possible alternative that would be more long-term, but I think the type of thing that he's talking about is way significantly more than $2 million. So I think we're talking here about if we're moving forward with some sort of project on Resurrection River, you're talking a minimum of a couple $1 million and probably something significantly more. So as Stephanie said earlier, you need to really look at the cost benefit. What are we trying to accomplish here, and how much money, how much of the taxpayers' money do we want to put into this to accomplish the end goal? And I'm not sure that we even know at this point what the end goal is. I mean, at one point there was talk about possibly channelizing the Resurrection River because of the issues at the airport, but I'm under the impression that the airport project is going forward along the lines of what the FAA has already recommended, consideration, even if you could keep the Resurrection River away from that long runway, to reach that long runway, it's been undercut so badly at this point that there's a lot more work to be done if somebody's thinking, long term about redoing that long runway. So I think that one of the things that maybe if we have additional work sessions or whatever, the first thing that everyone needs to decide is what is the intent of doing work on Resurrection River. One intent obviously is just general flood mitigation, and that is the business the flood board is in. Another intent may be, as Bob said, board member Reisner said that the intent would be to stabilize a portion of the delta for future development. I don't know if that's a viable option or not, but I think everyone needs to agree on what the intent is, and then certainly then you have to look at the flood mitigation or the cost of doing any of those kinds of projects. And then you have just in general, the 90, what was it, 96 or 98 agreement between the city and the borough to do mitigation, flood mitigation work on the river, and the report in 2006 shows it amended that, and how does that fit into whatever long-term thing we want to look at on the river. So, to my way of thinking, we're in very, very early stages here of looking at solutions for Resurrection River, and I think the first thing is to figure out what it is that the community wants, ultimately out of Resurrection River. We have a river that brings down literally millions of cubic yards of debris, from the glaciers on an annual basis. It deposits it in the lower reaches. It builds a delta that the airport is built on, and some other infrastructure of the city is built on. But that creates other issues. So those are long-winded bunch of comments there. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you. Councilmember Reisner, questions or comments for Seward at this time?
No questions or comments, but we do need to look at the, I believe we need to look at the footprint that could be out there for the future of Seward's economic development. We have to consider that, but the first step should be to protect against a meandering waterway, flood-proofing the area to the best of our ability, to make sure that we have adequate areas to deposit it very close by on the sediment that's removed, and to have more than just one catch basin in that whole stretch from the 3 bridges out to the bay.
Thank you, Bob. Councilmember DeCastro?
No questions or comments.
Councilmember Atwood?
Yeah, thank you. I guess just one comment, sort of following up on board member Stauffer's comments. I think a lot of the flats, the river delta area, I think it's going to serve as land for natural and beneficial function. We just, there's a lot of flooding, there's a lot of water, there's a lot of gravel, and perhaps some of that area might be suitable for development, but barring substantial grade infrastructure to try to redirect whatever sort of project we're talking about, I think my point earlier I was trying to make is there may be smaller perhaps less ambitious, but still somewhat effective, approaches to working in the river that we might take now, not 5 years from now. But anyway, that's my comment.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Atwood. I just have one comment myself at this time, and that is that you hear this from me probably quite often, is being prepared. It seems like when money comes, it comes all in a short window, and shovel-ready projects or plans that are on the shelf ready to implement seem to be the ones that benefit from that. And this might be a first step, and as Board Member Stauffer was talking about, is having an idea where you want to go is would be very beneficial. So, Mayor Terry, to you and the council.
So I'll just start off to answer some of Board Member Stauffer's kind of musings. From my point of view, the airport situation aside, regardless if we're getting, it seems like we're on the trajectory of the new runway. 20 years ago, the long runway wasn't threatened. So what I see is a very dynamic, braided riverine alluvial fan system where we need to be forward thinking. So in 20 years, a council isn't meeting with the flood board trying to protect the new runway that's built in the next few years. So I just want us to be aware of starting to think about how we can protect this airport in the future, knowing that river system, has been moving west and threatening the current infrastructure and could threaten future infrastructure. Looking at a $2 to maybe even $4 million project, I'd like to see if the flood board has any recommendation where we, rip wrap the old runway, knowing that they're taking off the topping of that. Maybe we have a project where we rip wrap the old runway and that acts as a levee, going down all the way down the couple levees down Jap Creek, and kind of match into that levee system if that's an option. So, my main thrust is protecting that airport. We've really seen that how important that airport is to this community, and we need to, set some plans in place so we don't get in a situation where we're having flooding. I just think it's, they were meeting in 1998, and, it's just, we can't go back and second guess, but, that long runway is such a loss. I hate to be having more of an infrastructure loss in future years. Councilmember Cease?
Nothing.
Councilmember Osenga?
Nothing.
Vice Mayor? Okay. So that's why I think it's important that we're meeting about this now.
Okay, Stephanie, back to you and floodplain parcel acquisition.
Just to follow up on what the mayor and Board Member Stauffer were talking about, and the changes to the Resurrection River, we were provided with some excellent aerial imagery from 1950 on page 44 of your packet, where we had the one short runway and lots of vegetation out of the river delta, with Resurrection River basically confined to the northeast. And then the long runway, I believe, was built in the 60s. And in the 70s photos, you can start to see through that vegetation these little channels of the floodplain building up on the northeastern side, and our low water or low elevation spot on the floodplain starts to become the airport. And then if you look ahead to the 1995 photo, right before the 86 event and then the 1995 event, those channels have been thoroughly carved through that forested area, and that has become the main channel of Resurrection River in recent times. And so I think if we look back at those photographs of the changes that the river has made in those decades and start thinking it forward, 40, 50 years from now, what is the expectation, what is the river going to do at that point in time? And what can we do to not only protect the airport, but where's the river going to go from there? And again, answering those questions through a watershed study and really looking at the alternatives to plan for 50 years from now is the best way to use our resources and our time and our taxpayer dollars. So moving on to something we can actually move forward with.
Stephanie, is it okay if I add a comment as well?
Orson, go ahead.
Sure, my comment about 1.75 versus 2 million was sort of a nitpicking thing. We're clearly in the scale of millions of dollars, and the channel is certainly going to be the cheapest option. I wanted to comment about the airport design. Moving the runway is to prevent the runway from being eroded, and that's the nature of the project. The very need for doing anything is because the river is threatening the existing runway. So to plan that project for a useful life on the order of 50 years, that's not a rule of thumb, 50-year project life, that is that project. That project should include the cost of keeping it safe from the river. So if we get involved in that project through our responsibility on the flood board and maybe some of these Corps of Engineers and other authorities, that's fine, but the new runway is to prevent the runway from being eroded and flooded by the river. It isn't something else. That's why it's being done. So that project must include the means to keep it safe, or it certainly won't be worth an investment. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Person. So back in February, I had several conversations with Mr. Steve Lear, and he provided the council and myself with an email regarding floodplain parcel acquisitions. So Mr. Lear, I spoke with him last week, is still has the offer to donate one of the floodplain parcels out in Resurrection River. This is a parcel that's adjacent to the end of the long runway. He actually owns two parcels out there. The one that he's interested in donating is here, right in the middle of the Resurrection River Delta. And I think he's interested in donating that parcel, for floodplain conservation. And if in the future there's additional work that needs to be done at the airport or flood mitigation work, he's providing that parcel as a donation for those expected projects. Last year, we, as a flood board, made the recommendation to acquire another donation parcel, this 20 acres right in the middle of the map there on page 30. That purchase agreement is at First National Title, and they're waiting on one more signatory or signature so they can close on that purchase agreement, and then that 20-acre parcel will be a borough parcel. The other developed parcels adjacent to the airport are the Crawford Riverside subdivisions, and over the years, the city of Seward has picked up several of these parcels through foreclosure process. And there's some advantages for the city to continue to do this, or to possibly offer to purchase at assessed value some of these parcels, or I should say all of these parcels out in the subdivision. For really looking at mitigation work, like we discussed the different types of programs and grant funding sources, having site control of an area for flood mitigation is key to some of those grants. the other advantage to acquiring parcels in the floodplain is for conservation or to create green space. As a National Flood Insurance Program participant, the city can receive points towards the NFIP community rating system. And the more points that the community can rack up, the lower the community members' flood insurance premiums will be. So I believe right now the city's been rated and provide a 10% discount to residents within the city on their flood insurance premiums. So there's a couple of advantages besides just having the green space for natural functions such as floodwater storage or wetlands or habitat. There's the advantage of getting points to decrease the flood insurance premiums for the residents. So I'd like to kind of open this up for discussion. I did also provide the list of parcels. You can see that the city of Seward has already acquired several of these parcels within the subdivisions. And the total assessed value, this was probably from January, so they may change, but the total assessed value was a little over $22,000. And when the flood board accepted the donation of the 20 acres, the flood board put $600 towards closing costs. So that's, doing the title insurance, search, etc. And I don't expect the closing costs will actually be a full $600, but that was what we put towards the closing costs. So I think if the city were to look at acquiring these parcels, there's several different property owners, that it might end up only being a couple of different purchase agreements. And then that would give the city residents the advantage of those discounted flood insurance premiums. So Chair, open it up for discussion on floodplain parcel acquisitions.
Yeah, and I think if this is the end of your presentation, Stephanie, we can open it up to all discussion at this time. And I'd like to start with the council at this time.
Scott, did you want to talk about the property acquisitions? You've discussed that previously with Stephanie, is that right?
Yeah, and I met with Steve and Jackie on this a couple times. So he is willing. It's not a difficult process. The borough recently did that other parcel, so we just kind of need indication if the council's willing to do that. And it's obviously not a real expensive or timely process. So
I'll look to Vice Mayor McClure.
You're referring to the entire batch pursuing?
No, just on the on page 29, the larger parcel that Mr. Lear had.
But he was donating that.
He wanted to donate that parcel, so we haven't actually implemented or taken action on that yet. I think that would be a good thing to do. And then again, it's a discussion item. Stephanie and I met, I believe last week, just talking about the city versus. It's good to have congruent, consistent ownership rather than this piece is owned by DNR and this piece is owned by the borough and this piece is the city. And her recommendation, I don't want to speak for her, but her recommendation was to try to get the city to encumber all of those in one process or as one block of properties.
So I guess I have a follow-up question about the properties on page 31 with all the various owners. I mean, I'm assuming there's nothing on those properties, and I'm assuming that the owners might be willing to sell at that assessed value. Has that been, has that been pursued?
Would you want to hear? Stephanie has an explanation of why they are interested in conveying ownership.
If I may, Mayor?
Could you go ahead, Stephanie?
Sure. So the 20 acres that was donated to the borough was owned by a group of people. And the Bolstridge parcels and the Rott parcels, I think there was one other name, those had all been bought by a group of people that were interested already in donating. So the Borough Land Management Team has already had a conversation with one of the property owners, and they are interested in donating the rest of those properties. I think it added up to 5 or 6 of those properties. The other property owners have not been contacted. But it's, a simple form letter to write, hey, we're interested in acquiring these floodplain parcels for conservation. Are you interested? And, most of these people have been paying taxes on these parcels for a very long time. I think that this area was subdivided many decades ago. So I think at this point in time, often it's a trust or heirs of the original property owners who've probably never seen this. And as far as I know, none of these parcels have any type of development on them. I haven't gone out there and walked all of them to actually see if there's, an old broken down cabin or not, but these would be acquirable, and usually a letter to the property owners can get that ball rolling.
And I would just like to be, transparent that the borough, we actually had the first right of refusal on that other parcel. So we did actually step away from that so the borough could take that because it is congruent and adjacent to their other pieces. So that made sense in that scenario, whereas this is a little different in that the city, if we went with the Lear property, it makes sense to try to keep those congruent as well.
Is that something, look to the council around here, is that something we want to pursue, or Vice Mayor?
Personally, I think we should pursue it.
I do too.
It's been sitting here since February when he suggested it, and then the COVID happened, and, so I don't know how we'd have to have a council resolution or something to do, or can we just?
Would it administratively
What do we need to
letters
do?
go out and then you would bring it back when it's final action?
Yeah, I think the first step would be is to either collaboratively or have us do that, or Stephanie's talked about that, just reach out to the ownerships. A lot of title research and things might be necessary to even identify who actually do you talk to on some of these. There might be estate issues, and but I think we could collaborate on that together with Stephanie's and our planning department and try to figure out a solution and move forward. We just want to get that indication that is the desire to do that.
Well, personally, I think we should. I don't know about the rest.
I don't know if there's any objections. Okay. So, sorry to have you guys hanging on. You heard all that discussion. I have one other item, and it's maybe a question back to board member Orson Smith. So in the, I think this is right on track with what we're talking about. So with the location of the new runway, the state says it's much further away from the river, reducing flooding and erosion, but it doesn't say, I think it's more in the immediate as opposed to the future. So is there a role at all for the city and the flood board to send some sort of letter to that project, making sure, or finding out how long that they're, potentially guaranteeing, or, they can tell us they've designed it so that, there's not going to be any flooding impact for 20 years, 50 years. Is there any value in that? Because, board member Smith is exactly right. They should be designing for future flood protection, and I'm not sure that happened.
Is that a question for?
I don't know. It's just a thought for the flood board if they see any value in, it's just up for discussion. I mean, is that something that you've seen done before, or how would you recommend that we ensure that they're planning for that?
Well, I suppose I could elaborate a bit on my comment. To me, I'm an engineer, and it's good practice. If the point is to provide reliable air runway for airplanes, there must be a project life. And since the main threat to the existing runway is flooding and erosion, there must be a rationale. In fact, I would say good practice would call for that very issue to be most explicitly addressed in the design. But I can't claim to have reviewed their design details or the engineer's report on that. But if they haven't done that, I certainly agree with your suggestion that they should be called to task. That design should very definitely include a projection of how long that runway is going to last. And if it's not going to last long enough because the river threatens, then flood protection and erosion control should be a very important component of the design. So I think we understand each other, Mayor, and I agree with your point that if this isn't addressed in the proposed plan, then it should be.
Okay. And I guess what was a red flag to me in some of their planning was, closing that long runway, and then they have the sentence, and allow it to be breached by the river sometime in the future. So if they're planning on the breach, maybe we do just need to clarify with them that they've made other plans to ensure the ongoing protection of the new runway that they're building. So thank you for your comments. That got me really thinking.
If I may, Mary.
Yes.
So alternative 1.1, which is elevating the long way in its existing alignment. They found through the flood hazard modeling that they expected, even if they elevated that by 2 feet, that it would be overtopped within 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so meet their design criteria that Board Member Smith is talking about. I'm looking through their final EA and FONSI to see if I can find, I believe they designed to a 50-year design requirement. They are planning with the new runway to elevate it by 2 feet above the base flood elevation. Mm-hmm. So the elevation of the airport is currently below the base flood elevation, so they will be elevating that runway several feet, plus 2 feet of freeboard, which is 2 feet of elevation above the current 100-year flood event. I'll look for it and send out an email if I find it, but I think they have to design to a 50-year design specs. They have to show that it's going to last that long, which Mother Nature will see.
And Mayor Terry, also one of the things in their project is to riprap the new runway, and there was some discussion, and I don't know if that was finalized, but utilizing the long runway currently as a source of riprap for that.
I don't know. Is there any further discussion in here? We'll turn it over to you for discussion.
I'll go around the table again, the virtual table. Comments, Board Member Smith?
I've said a lot, but I still, in spite of the higher elevation and intention to riprap, I think it should be perfectly clear to anyone, engineer or not, the design life of that new alignment with regard to the threats from the Resurrection River. So I still think it's a good point to ask for a clarification. Mark, back to you.
Thank you. Board Member Stauffer?
Yeah, I pretty much made my comments from last time.
Ken?
Okay, I feel if we keep the outlet of Resurrection River where it is currently at, within 50 years, we will lose the runway. Not just the long one, but the one they're proposing to build in the near future. 174,000 cubic yards down that river every year of sediment, and a lot of it, such as riprap in the past, has wound up underneath the Alaska Railroad pier. Now, until the Alaska Railroad gets its expansion project breakwater built, they're still going to be suffering underneath those rocks and bed loads if we line something with riprap and that breakwater is not built. So in the future, how will this look if we leave the channel where it's at now? It will shift further west regardless. As the plane fills, it's going to go to the next lowest spot, which is the airport. That's why I suggest we move that outlet away from the airport to eliminate that problem and once and forever align it with something that we can work with that's locally available. GHS in Soldotna Kenai provides sheet piling and sheet piling installation services. They're local. I don't see how we can do it keeping the alluvial plain as it sits for any kind of long term until we get some gravel out on an established channel that will allow the water to flow out. And it's going to take some work with a bulldozer. I've been out there dozens of times since 2011 walking over the entire area. As for structures out there in that subdivision, the only thing I've ever seen is a couple of rotted posts. That's it. From old structures of homes that were put in back during the original subdivision of the 1930s. I'm done.
Thank you, Board Member Reisner. Board Member DeCastro?
I think it's been pretty well discussed, so I don't have any further comments.
Board Member Atwood?
Yes, thank you. I just had one comment or a thought. Stephanie was speaking earlier about the CRS program, community rating system, and the ability for the municipality to help with reduced flood insurance rates. And I was thinking about the Crawford subdivision and some of the parcels out in the flats, and clearly getting some of those properties out of partnership and into public ownership is a good idea, but I think what might help to facilitate open space credit under the CRS program is perhaps a more appropriate zoning designation in some instances. I believe a lot of that out there is zoned resource management, and if you were to check the allowed uses table in the city code, it allows for a lot of development. Anyway, that's just a thought. I don't know if the city or the community development department, for that matter, would be interested in, say, a conservation zone that might be applied where appropriate, but that's just a thought that I had. Thanks.
Mayor Terry, did someone there want to respond to Board Member Atwood's comment?
I think what we'll do is we'll just take that comment back as the city manager's working with the community development, and I saw him making a note of that, so that was a good comment.
Okay, that completes the presentation. Is there any further discussion that board members or council members would like to have at this time?
Well, I'll just close out and say thank you for the education. We know that you guys deal with this on a daily basis, all the intricacies, so I just want to thank you for all the time spent in getting us up to speed again on all things Resurrection River, and giving us more of an education even peripherally on some of the things happening with Jap Creek and other river systems in the area, so thank you all.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Taylor has his hand raised.
Board Member Taylor?
Yes, sir. One of the things that were addressed in the original was possible rechannelization of the northeast channel. And with the thought that comes to mind when we were discussing the acquisition of properties, is it still a feasible idea to partially, or as we acquire these properties, to be able to rechannelize through them to take the river and flow it further north or east, whichever direction this turns out to be, but away from the current flow and trying to get it back up through the Crawford subdivision instead of so close to the airport.
Stephanie, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, that was the discussion as to why the borough took over the 20-acre parcel upstream of the runway, was if there is a potential to do mitigation to rechannelize Resurrection River, then the borough's got at least 2 parcels through to work with. And then if the city had, if the city was able to acquire the rest of that subdivision, we would be able to work through those 2 areas. We would already have site control if we were able to come up with the funding and a plan to do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from flood board members? All right, if hearing none, I think what we'll do is look for public comment sent in to us. If there's anyone listening to this, either the recording or live, that would like to make comment, please do so by emailing the flood board office. The email address is on the borough website for the flood board. And we'll get those either to the board or to the city council as appropriate. And I would like to thank everyone for participating tonight. I hope it was a useful meeting for both groups, and we'll continue the discussion in the future. With that, I'll turn back to Mayor Terry.
We'll go ahead and adjourn all. Thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.